Welcome to the Grace Hour Show,
a
Christian program. Thank you. Dive into our daily challenges.
Not just me, everybody else. I thought you were talking to me, so thank you.
We're trying to learn our faith in a practical way.
Well,
here,
it's
Philippe.
practical, all right.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Pastor Paul Andrulonis.
Yes,
and I'm
you
joined
are.
by Philippe here in the studio.
We're together in the studio. Fist bump.
Here we go.
And Jehu is also here.
You seem like you're doing well today.
Well,
I don't think I need to ask you.
I had a mission. I went to back in my office to get my glasses. And it took me a while because I went to the office, it was locked, I forgot the keys, came back to, anyways, but I did it, so I'm very proud of myself.
Now you're here.
I accomplished the mission.
Just in time.
Simple, very easy mission, but I did it.
You know, it's the little victories.
It's the tiny one.
It's the little victories.
This is tiny and halfway ridiculous.
It's like faith in the little things.
Yes.
Faith in the little things helps us to have our faith in the big things. And maybe that goes along with what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
This week, the conversation and the topics for all the episodes are based in apologetics. This is a week about apologetics.
Yes.
And today we're going to be talking about faith and science.
Yes.
How they relate to one another, whether or not they contradict one another, how we can understand scientifically the things about the world, and then how that can relate to our faith, and what role does faith play in our understanding of science. So do you want to start us off, Philippe, with this discussion?
I could. And I will.
Okay, good.
I scared you for a moment. No, but before, if you haven't listened to the show yesterday, I highly recommend that you listen to Pastor Roger and Lizzie Robbins. They've done a killer job on explaining the relationship between apologetics and evangelism, which is often a misunderstood relationship, and the way they laid it out, the principles that show how they work together, and how one apologetic is the servant of the other, which is evangelism. Because the goal of our life is not, arguing with people, but it's presenting the gospel and answering questions that do become obstacles to sharing the gospels. So they got it from a book, and then you can listen to get the reference. Like the goal of the Christian when we preach the gospel is not to start an argument on the teleological arguments, wondering if God exists or not, but rather to put a stone in somebody's shoes. All right, when we walk and we have comfortable shoes, I can have the best comfortable shoes possible. If there is a stone or sand that goes in my shoe, I have to stop and remove it because I can't walk. And it's the idea that I really like about, sometimes when you present the gospel and then you challenge people even intellectually because you are bringing some apologetic, arguments into the conversation because it was warranted at the moment. And then you are, putting a stone in somebody's shoes that they have to stop and consider it, And I like the idea. So, and to introduce the topic today, which is faith and science, I'm sure many of us have heard people ask the question this way: this is the 21st century. How come you still believe in God? Like we have science to explain the world. And this is what we call a propositional statement, where people make a statement without being really understanding the underlying assumptions that are there. And one is faith and science are incompatible. They don't work together. So we had faith. If you look at the history of faith and science, you will realize that for many scientists who became or who are atheists, they will tell you that God was there to explain the gap in our misunderstandings. Like in the 16th century, we didn't know what we know today, so we put God wherever we didn't have an explanation.
Yeah.
Now we explain the world in its totality, therefore we don't need God. And that makes so many wrong assumptions that we can understand the world, which it's not true, We don't. And if science were to be explaining everything, it would explain how things work, but not why they're there. So like I'm holding my phone here. That's one example I give to my senior class at GGCA. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to tell you a challenge. Now, if I were to look at this phone, completely dismantle it piece by piece, and succeeded at telling you how it works and why every piece is there, right? Do I understand how it works? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Would this be okay for me to conclude, therefore, the Apple company does not exist? That would be ridiculous. Yeah. Right? That's exactly the assumption that is made when people say this is the 21st century. We don't need God to explain the world today. And basically, yeah, that's what we talk about. How do faith and science relate? So I'm going to make a few points that I have on my notes here, and then maybe you and I can talk about this. And at some point we're going to turn to Psalm 19 because you have a few things to say that I think is going to be super interesting. The big question here that I have is, are faith and science in conflict? And I would say no, they're not. If faith and science, I understand it for what they are. Now, sometimes I'm going to use two words that describe the wrong side of science and then the wrong side of faith, right? Science becomes scientism if the philosophy says that science is the only way to know anything, right? It's an absolute meaning. If you don't know anything by science, then you don't know anything, which is it doesn't work in reality because many things we know are, like
not
how
explainable.
how can science investigate whether Napoleon existed or not? Mm-hmm. It's not science. It's a history investigation. So there's that. But on the other side, so science becomes scientism. Sometimes faith becomes fideism, and fideism is the absolute idea that reason is opposite to science, to faith. And the only way for us to live our life as Christians is to believe no matter what. There are clear evidence of things, and we choose the side of faith, quote unquote, which is not revelation in the Bible, is the way I feel about it. And at this point, either when we have on one side fideism or on the other side scientism, yes, they become in conflict, right? So are proper faith and proper science in conflict? No. If faith is understood the way the Bible defines it, and if science stays in its lane, then they're not in conflict. And furthermore, we'll say later that science was made possible by Christian principles, right? So that's what I wanted to start with.
Yeah, I mean, that's such the two ends of the spectrum that you just mentioned, faith and reason, for faith or fideism and scientism, as you mentioned, like that they are separated from one another, mutually exclusive from one another. They can't correlate. They can't help each other or impact one another. Is something that I think it's important for us to clarify and to understand in our lives, because there are things about the world that we live in that are explainable, and there are things about the world that are outside of that realm of being explainable. And I think any scientist that has studied all the different things can, as you mentioned, understand how something functions. But there is the other aspect of it, the things outside of it, of why it is the way that it is, which is difficult to understand outside of a faith in something. What are you having your faith in is like the apologetic viewpoint that we're talking about today. Am I having faith that things are the way they are because of this unexplainable thing that we have put in place of God, and have that be the reason that I believe the way that I do, or to have there be a God who created the heavens and the earth and have that be the thing that I am trusting in and believe started this chain reaction of things that are happening. So we're looking at it from, looking back and try to explain something that already existed from our viewpoint, from our perspective, without having a full picture of the grand scheme of how everything works. And theories and trying to explain things that are unexplainable have happened throughout history, throughout centuries, as you mentioned. In a lot of cases, the search for meaning, the search for a purpose, the search for why things are the way they are was directed towards God initially by a lot of scientists, by a lot of those individuals who discovered a lot of the scientific principles that are foundational to an explanation of these different things. And they all started with this looking up to the stars, or looking beyond the creation in order to explain the creation, as opposed to looking at the creation to explain everything that exists. So that's definitely, as you were describing that, the phone dynamic of explaining all the different pieces that put it together, and looking at it to explain how it functions and what it does and all these different things. There's this simplicity of not knowing that. Like we can get into the nitty gritty to why this is the way that it is, or we can give that to somebody and say, here, call somebody on this phone. So we can get into understanding how the chips work, the battery size, all the different things that make it function the way that it does. But if I don't use it for its purpose, then am I really seeing the benefit of that thing? And the same can be true of like the things that we see in the world around us, the created things, and scientific explanation can get us into the hows and the details and the weeds of what things are and how they function. But if I'm missing the purpose behind it, then I'm missing the whole point of it. Like, and the person that just uses the phone but doesn't know how it works is actually reaping more of the benefit than the person who can explain it all but doesn't actually use it for its function. Like you could say, like you give an iPhone to that's just used like for my grandmother for, I don't know how this works. I was like, okay, just push this button, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's magic.
Yeah.
And this is like this thing, like we know it's not magic. We know the technology, and we can take that idea and we can make it magic is ridiculous. Something outside of the explainable is ridiculous, but so the purpose behind it, the reality of it, and the use of it, and the why it's functioning the way that it is sometimes and is more important than how it does the things that it does. And it's meant to point us towards the why and the reason behind those things. So
absolutely. And I would say like we're jumping ahead a little bit, but the conversation I think. But what's interesting is realizing that when I understand the fact that science is capable of understanding the world and still discovering things and adapting theories, there's a couple things that we have to understand. Number one is this urgency or this urging, that we feel to understand the world around us.
Yes.
And the underlying assumption that we can understand the world around us with two things that cannot be scientifically proven, but drive the scientific endeavor, which point to the higher concept of purpose and design and yearning that we have to make sense of the world we're in. If you and I were just products or byproduct of an evolution, because there was no, like at this point, every species would be a byproduct because it would be an accident, then why, do we have all the features that we do? And we'll talk about this Friday on Grace Hour is how do we challenge the faith, I want to say, of the atheists, is realizing that there are many things that don't make sense if God does not exist. And science is one of them, because science is predicated on the fact that truth does exist. And that in itself is contradictory to the evolutionary theory. The model of evolution brings no purpose, no meaning, no beginning, no end, absolutely no direction. Things just happen because they do, right? And Richard Dawkins, in one of his books, The Selfish Gene, and then he repeated it in his other book, the God Delusions. And he says basically, when you look at the world is chaotic, it's dangerous, it's evil, these things. But if we believe evolution to be true, our answer to all these challenges should be, it must be so. That's all he says. He calls it is it the despair? I have to look at the word, I don't remember, but he's basically saying indifference. He called it that our response to the world the way it is should be indifference. What's interesting is then, there is 8 billion people or so on the planet, and 8 billion people are asking the same questions. Why is there so much evil in the world? So no one out of the 8 billion people in this world are actually living according to the principles that should be the consequences of us evolving into what we are today. We're all asking the question, what is the purpose of my life? What is the meaning? Am I loved? Am I validated? All these questions that makes us human beings, which is like way bigger than just matter and energy, that science cannot explain. And he's trying to, Richard Dawkins is trying to convince us that this should be our philosophy. And all this to say that the reason why science did such a great job in the last 4 centuries, it is because we're looking at the world and we know, intrinsically, that the world can be understood, but we cannot explain why. And I think the only way to explain this is to say, yes, number one, God has created the world, and he gave us the intelligence to look around, and also, as we read later in Psalm 119, unless we want to read it now, but God has created the world for us to see his glory. And all of a sudden, you go between, this is the 21st century, science explains all the world, we don't need God, to realizing, hold on for a second. God creating the world makes absolutely more sense than a world without God. And that's what we have to understand, right? So it's not just, faith is on this corner and science is the other one. And as soon as the bell bing, then there's a fight and we'll see who wins. One is predicated on the fact that faith is both rejected and accepted by borrowing the principle. Like the only way for us to know anything is to believe that truth is possible. And the only way for us to believe that is that there's an absolute. And there wouldn't be an absolute if there were no God. So it's Van Til, one of my favorite apologists, used to say it's just like a girl who is 3 years old and his dad is 6'3", and the only way for her to slap him in the face was for him to sit down and have her on his lap, and then he would get slapped in the face. That's the only way he would do, even as a joke, and it's the same thing. God is sitting, puts us on his lap, supporting our lives, and that's how we can spit in his face by deciding. So, wow. and even further, like if you read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, he's making the point. Like if God did not create my brain to think, it wouldn't be reliable. And to get the result that we have as a byproduct, an accident of evolution, of a working mechanism that allows us to think, the odds are the same. If you would take a milk jug, he says, throw it on the floor and get a map of London. Same idea. And he says, if God does not exist, then thought do not exist. Right? And then, therefore, none of my arguments against God could be any valuable. Therefore, no thought would be valuable at all. So, basically, for science to be something requires a faith element. That's why I'm saying they're not in conflict, right?
Yeah, they're not in conflict, and they both require a faith. Just what is that faith in? And one thing that you were saying is earlier on when we were talking about this evangelism and the role apologetics plays in evangelism are, you mentioned the putting a stone in the shoe of the other person. Maybe this is kind of out of what we were just talking about, but it's just thinking about in these conversations and the discussions we have in faith, in our Christian faith, in our theological discussions and things like that. And then as we're discussing scientific elements or other explanations, do you think there is any type of benefit to, because we typically in these types of conversations, maybe we're trying to each side is trying to convince the other of whatever their position is. And as you mentioned, the goal of apologetics and evangelism is not to win an argument, but to put a stone in the shoe or to have a consideration. How important is that consideration or those things to be received as much as given to the other person? So like if I'm going and I'm evangelizing somebody and I have an apologetic argument and we're discussing something in particular, and they bring up an element, that scientific explanation for something that they are using in their framework and their faith to explain why God doesn't exist, or to explain why this is not the truth, and they know the truth. How important is it for me to have that consideration, or to be able to recognize those things as they relate to my walk of faith or my understanding of what I believe? Yeah. Because like I said, we usually are trying to convince one way or the other, but in both directions, there has to be an element of consideration or an element of openness to at least receive or understand the viewpoint of the other person on the other side of the argument, not only to convince them or for me to recognize like why it is I believe what I believe, and how does science play into the faith that I believe, the things that I believe in faith about God. I don't know. Does it? Makes total sense, and I think it's a very good question. And I'm trying to process in what order I could bring in the points. I think the number one thing we have to realize is faith and science are not in conflict, and we need to bring in the conversation at this point. Because right now I'm right. Let's say I'm the scientist and you're the Christian. I'm trying to go over there, and then it's, we have this argument because we both believe they're incompatible. Yeah. And I think the first thing we have to understand is both ways. Number one, I'm not rejecting science at all. I know some Christians are very strong on rejecting science because look how science has been wrong so many times the last 400 years. Okay, fine, I get it, but it's been more right than wrong, So I cannot use that as an argument. And I've been sick
to the point of dying at some point, like 14 years ago. And I'm very thankful that science was able to bring me back to life.
Yeah.
So I know it works, right? So in many ways, I flew here. You took a flight. We have cars, we have microphones, we have all these things, and these are technological advances that are made possible by science. So rejecting science is not the move that I'm saying we should have as a Christian at all.
Yeah.
I think what made a difference for me personally is because in my family, on my mom's side, a good half of my cousins and uncles and aunts are in the science world. My aunt and an uncle are now retired, of course, but he was a president of the University of Mathematics, in France. His wife, my aunt, was a professor of mathematics in university. One of my cousins is an astrophysicist. He's a professor in university in Bern, Switzerland. His sister is a biologist. So my conversation with my family are always interesting. And what helped me a lot is I studied philosophy of science in university because I'm not a scientist at all. But the conversations were interesting when actually I was able to, I remember this, it's like imagine the Christmas table and then we're all around and my cousin just finished his PhD and his dad, the three of us were drinking coffee in the corner of the house and having a conversation. And for some reason, my uncle Noah, I'm a Christian, he's an atheist, and he says, you know what, there's nothing more objective than science. And I tell him, hold on for a second. He said, what do you mean? Well, the science is very simple, right? And the point being is, because my idea to resolve the conflict is understanding, I'm telling him, his name is Daniel, so Uncle Daniel, you have to understand that faith and science are investigating two different realms, right? But the fact that one realm cannot investigate the other does not mean the other world realm does not exist. So we have this conversation. I don't know what you're saying. I said, I'm going to give you an example because it tells me science is super objective in a way. Like, okay, and I said, tell me how. Well, it's simple. We have a theory. We test it over and over again, and the results would tell us whether a theory is viable or if it's true or false.
Yeah.
I said, okay, but let me ask you a question. How do you choose which theories are you willing to test? I don't know what you mean. Well, but for example, I'm telling you, I'm asking my cousin who's right there, whose specialty is finding, he's been dedicating his career to finding life on another planet. So that's what he does. Mm-hmm. So I'm asking the questions, what are the theories for the coming into existence of the universe, because that's a known fact. The universe was not eternal. So the conversation, well, you have the Big Bang theory, and then this and this, and so, well, you're missing one. This is what God created in the universe. Well, that cannot be tested by science. How do you know? And he says, what do you mean? Well, you made a philosophical choice of not trying to test out a theory because it doesn't suit your beliefs. And he says, what do you mean? I said, what I mean is you only test theories that already assumes are possible within your understanding of the world. So you're not objective. You're testing things that you already believe in, and you reject theories.
To prove that,
yes.
Yeah.
So, and I told him, can we agree that faith is not objectively objective? Absolutely. He said, I see your point. And that's the thing is, and then we went on a conversation explaining the point is, you and I are not in conflict. I'm just also telling you that science cannot reject God because science cannot test God. And faith makes science possible because you're making assumptions as a scientist that you cannot prove scientifically. Mm-hmm. There's another realm of understanding, So that would be one way to address the question. It was I could say a lot more things, but I think it would be a good way to think about this way. Is that okay? I have some things here. I'm just going to read. The first, science presupposes that truth exists and that the universe can be understood.
Yeah,
I don't know that. How do I know? Chesterton said reason is in itself a matter of faith. Mm-hmm. Because I believe that my reason is capable of understanding the world around me because it makes sense to me, but I don't know if it's true at all. Mm-hmm. So all these faith assumptions that science is making is actually showing the relationship between the two. Mm-hmm. And all these faith assumptions cannot be proven if God doesn't exist, but can be explained if there is an absolute being behind the universe. So I think my goal, at least the way I understand it, in a conversation with a scientist when it comes down to faith and reason of faith and science, is not entertaining the idea of conflict, is entertaining a new idea for most scientists that only for you to be able to be rationally grounded is to believe in absolutes. which cannot be true if there is no God. Right? Make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that like we can grow and we can learn in those, understanding those reference points, understanding those absolutes, and looking to, like I said, have reconciliation or to have interaction and to have relationship within those things, as opposed to, assuming that you don't know, I know better than you, or assuming that what you believe is untrue or is meaningless or doesn't apply in this argument, or whatever the case is. Because I think it is on both sides of those arguments, you can kind of discredit the other person just based on the system of belief that they have. Like you were saying, oh, God, you can't test that by science. That's an assumption that you have made in your worldview in this conversation. How many times do we have those assumptions and make those assumptions in our conversations and in our interactions with one another, where we don't even realize that we are starting off at this point where we actually are never going to understand one another, because we actually don't trust or we don't think that the other person's faith or beliefs are valid. And I think we can learn from those things, learn from those positions in the absolute sense of the term, as far as wanting to be relating to one another, as opposed to convincing one another or discrediting one another or interacting with one another in that way. And I think we can read maybe, like you were saying, there's aspects of these two things, faith and science, where they explain, or they are in two different realms. I think that's an important thing for us to emphasize, is that there are things that are explainable and there are things that are not explainable. There are things, and I think it was in Proverbs, where was it? I just had it. In Proverbs, it talks about Proverbs chapter 30. It talks about things that are too high for me to understand. And I think I'd like to, in these conversations and these things that we say, there's Proverbs chapter 30, verse 18. It says, there are three things which are too wonderful for me. Yes, four which I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. And I think, like, in some of these things now, because of scientific discovery and the information that we have and the way that we can examine things and test things and knowing how these things happen, maybe we can understand some of these things in a different way than Solomon did when he wrote this proverb about things that I don't understand. How do they do these things that they do? But there's that fourth thing, the way of a man with a woman. We can try to explain different aspects of our experience, different aspects of creation, but there are things that are not measurable, and there are things that are not, that I will never be able to put my finger on and say, this is why this is the way that it is. I can examine the brain and examine what happens when a man sees a woman that he loves, and see the signals go off in the brain, but the feelings that he is feeling. And this is, I think, part of that two different realms of things, because if I believe that everything has to be explainable and is documentable, or everything is just a trigger or a switch, or it's just a reaction of chemicals and hormones in my body as a human being, then how much does it restrict my view of love and review of relationship, which is such a big part of humanity in our interaction with one another, is about the relationship. It's part of the reason why we are looking for the truth, in order to see why bad things happen to good people, in order to see why things are the way that they are, in order to prevent evil from happening in the world, is based in the relationship, in the common good that we see between humanity. And if all the things that I am doing are just a result of switches being flipped in my brain, then is there really that purpose behind all these things, or am I just a result of these things happening biochemically or neurologically, and all these different things? It kind of diminishes those things, diminishes why are you even searching? That's just your brain flipping switches so that you can do something and have a purpose in your life. It's actually not even a real thing. It's just a reaction to the stimuli in your life. And if you think about it in that way, it kind of diminishes the entire reason for seeking out truth. If there isn't something bigger, if there isn't something greater and something absolute that I'm going after.
Absolutely. I think the point being is really, and then I think we'll go in details on Friday. I think I'm doing with Pastor Mike Garrett on Friday, just challenging the concept of atheism with a few fundamental ideas that we embrace as human beings that cannot be explained if God does not exist. And one of them is exactly this: it's the reduction of humanity. If we believe like an atheist believe, and like most scientists who believe in that there is no God, they become what we call materialists. They believe only matter and energy. That's such a reduction of the reality of human beings. There's many things that cannot be explained in just these small factors. There's more to us. And also, the point being is that making sense of the world is not a need for survival. So if you and I just evolved into who we are today to explain that we were needed to be who we are so we can survive in the world, it does not even cut it. Because when you think about this, and then I think I said this to my students, in the class. Think about this way: if you take a gorilla or a chimpanzee, which we're supposed to be descending from, you throw both of us in the world without any protection in the jungle, who will have more chance to survive? The chimpanzee. Mm-hmm. So I'm less adapted to this world than he is, and I'm supposed to be a better version. Right? So that would be one question, because we have to, and then say, well, why do we have a brain? We have a brain because we need the brain to survive. Well, hold on for a second. There's hundreds of millions of species out there, right? And none of those species anywhere, insects and living animals and plants and bacteria, have our brain capacity, right? Mm-hmm. Do they survive? They absolutely do. Yeah. So why do we need such a powerful brain capacity? We don't need it to survive, right? Yeah. So there's an attempt to explain, well, if you don't make a difference between a cat and a tiger, you're most likely to be dead, because of the end of the day. Well, antelopes know the difference between the cat and the tiger. That's why they run. They don't have our brain capacity, Yeah. So the point is, when we try to look at this world and realize none of what we experience as human beings on an emotional level, the love you were talking about, the need for a relationship and social interactions, all these things cannot be explained by basic instincts at all. So the one way of understanding our faith, one of the reasons why we still believe that faith and science are not in conflict, if they are properly understood for one and the other, it's because one is explaining how the world works, and the other is explaining why the world it is what it is. Mm-hmm. Now, the mistake we can make as Christians sometimes is we draw the line further to faith and enter into fideism when we reject any scientific endeavor that seems to be an attack against God, like the Big Bang, for example. What do I care if it's true or not? Could I see the Big Bang in Genesis 1? And, some people are going to they say, "Oh, are you kidding me?" It says, the Hebrew word for, Genesis 1 is tohu bohu, which means there's void and chaos.
Yeah, chaos, yeah.
Okay, all right. So, it's a billion of years. I get it. But then before we react, imagine my cousin who's an astrophysicist, if I tell him, you're such a jerk, believe in billions of years, you think the conversation will go anywhere? I don't think so. Number one, because he's fully convinced. Number two, also because he has, according to him, compelling reasons to believe this way.
Yeah.
Which we can discuss,
Sure.
And then in my conversation one day, I this is how I drew the line. For me, in any attempt to explain the relationship between faith and science, we have to know where we draw the line, what is acceptable and not acceptable. Yeah. But as a non-scientist, my line cannot be scientific. It has to be theological. So, what is the ultimate foundational idea in the Bible that have to be true? The connection between sin and death. It's clear in the Bible. The reason why we have death in this world is because of sin. So Adam and Eve must be the first one to experience sin and then death. There couldn't be any death before that, right? Mm-hmm. So that means there couldn't be any evolution before Adam and Eve. But could the one day be 10,000 years of each day? Let's say it this way. So the world before Adam and Eve arrived, it was 50,000 years old. Is it possible? Yes, if there's no death. Well, if the birds were created on the third day, lived for 20,000 years before they saw Adam and Eve. Yes, of course, people are going to argue, but the word yom in Hebrew, I get it. But I'm talking about how do I relate to people, and where I draw the line in conversation that I have with a non-believer. So my point here is very significant to me in the relationship we can have. If I enter into fideism, where I'm defending a Hebrew word in a conversation with a scientist, I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But if I tell him why I believe what I believe in one way, then my line is theological. And I know that now I'm relaxed. People say, "Why I believe the universe is 14 billion years old." Okay, all right, let's start with that. Okay, still, if evolution is true, right? I accept that. If the universe is 14 billion years and there was a Big Bang, you still haven't answered the question: how did it work? Where does the matter that exploded 14 billion ago come from?
Yeah.
You still need a reason why to explain why we're here.
And there still is a faith that goes along with
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
So, and that origin must be outside of the existing universe. Otherwise, you would be contingent, and then obviously he couldn't be the reason. Just like I couldn't be the reason why I'm here. My parents were. Yeah. So I think it's interesting sometimes for us to not enter into this fideism idea. Keep our faith, know what our convictions are, and help someone say, okay, let's say I give you everything you believe in. Where do we come from?
Yeah.
And the question remains.
Yeah.
Right? So whether I reject evolution or accept it for the sake of the argument in the conversation, they still have to account for the reason why we're here. And I think that's a powerful way of doing it.
Yeah, I think so too. And at that point you're saying of drawing the line or having a determination and in your conversation, approaching them in a way that is beneficial both to you and to them, as far as clearly drawing the lines of what your belief is centered in. Because we can try to have a scientific debate with, like, if I have a theological belief about the origin of the universe and you have a scientific one, and I'm trying to convince you scientifically of a theological origin, then as you mentioned, there's going to be a disconnect that exists, because it's very unlikely that I know scientifically as much as the other person who has based their belief on that, and vice versa. It's very unlikely that they will understand why I believe what I believe, and that's the thing that I think is difficult in these conversations, is that we think we know more than the other person does. I think I know scientifically because I read a few books, or confirmation bias has proven that there's different things that connect with this scientific explanation for the universe, as opposed to me just trusting that God created the universe. And I'm trying, did you hear about this? And did you hear about this? And they'll just come back to me with, well, yeah, did you hear about this, and this, and this? Yes. And I'm like, oh crap! Now I'm not on the same playing field. And then vice versa. They say, well, did you? Does the Bible say this, and does the Bible say that? And maybe they know the Bible, but as far as my belief of the Bible is concerned, we can make assumptions in these conversations about what we think the other person is basing their understanding on, or basing their viewpoint on. And I think that's where these conversations kind of start off on the wrong foot, as you were mentioning, like that, drawing a line is like, okay, if we're going to have this conversation, my faith is theological and yours is scientific, and how can we interact with one another in order to understand one another, so that we can have fellowship and have relationship and help find truth? Yeah, because that's the point of this. That's the science is designed to experiment and to observe and to look at the physical universe and to find out the truth about it, why things are the way that they are. And as we've already said, there are aspects where that scientific method has found truths about what makes the world the way that it is, why the earth is the way that it is, why the seasons are, all the different things that over centuries scientific research and development has proven that there are truths that exist within the material universe that explain things. And I think in our faith, if that's what theologically, that's also what we're looking for. We're looking to find the truth about us as human beings and what this is all about. And we're doing the same thing, but we're assuming that we are starting from from incorrect starting points, which, depending on how the conversations are and depending on what our goal is, we would be. But the reality is that we're looking for the truth. And I think that in our faith and in these conversations that we have scientifically and theologically, we can kind of get in our own way in trying to have this communication. From the jump. We get in our own way, and the conversation really never goes anywhere because we've assumed that this person's an idiot in both directions,
Yes.
we are assuming the same
Yes.
thing, really.
Yes.
Which is maybe a hard thing to say, but can I listen and can I let someone else say something and not rebut them immediately or whatever the case is, if I really want to have a restoration of
Yes.
relationship, not just a laying down of you're right, I'm wrong type of thing. But let's like have this conversation. The reality is, and maybe I'll just read Psalm chapter 19
Yes.
And verse 1, which says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth his handiwork. There are explainable things. There are truths about the world that scientific research and experimentation have made clear and have shown, and they are pointing towards this God that created the heavens and the earth, and that the point of this search for truth is inevitably to bring glory to God, not to bring glory to me. And in if scientists are really in the pursuit of truth, then they will be looking for the truth about the universe. And if God is the truth, that his glory and that his purpose is behind everything, then it's not about the paper that I publish or the finding that I have, because I don't think, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, initially in scientific experimentation or in those founding scientific people, they weren't trying to exalt themselves.
No.
Or to make a name for themselves. They were just trying to understand and find truth. And maybe that's where we've shifted in a way, is like, I'm not only just trying to find truth, but I'm trying to be the one who finds the truth. Trying to be the one who can say, this is why things are the way that they are. And maybe we don't have time to go into all those different things, but maybe we can talk about that in a way. The search for truth initiated by from a maybe Christian found standpoint, or a beyond the material universe pursuit by those original scientific fathers, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, well, just we argued earlier that the only way to do science is to presuppose Christian principles. Even if you reject God, then you have to accept the consequences of his existence to do science at all. Believe that truth is possible, that you can understand the world, we can relate it, we can understand it, all these things. And furthermore, I think if you look at history, science developed in Christian countries, mostly. For two reasons. Number one, because of Psalm 119, they look at the world, think this is amazing, let's discover it for the sake of God's glory. So when you look at as early as, and even if you go down to the Greeks are 3 centuries before Christ, the philosophers, the scientists, they were understanding the world in the same way we do. Like, wow, the gods who created the world are amazing. So there's a concept of idea, like, it's just like in a way, like when I was handed this phone, I can understand how to use it every time, even if I don't know how it works. When I got it, I know they made it user friendly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if I would never be able to use it, and so in a way, the universe is user friendly, right? So you wonder, why is that? I can look at the world,
water, air to breathe.
Yes,
yeah.
And I'm here like, wow, I can enjoy all these things. I can see, like, who doesn't like to see it as a sunset or a sunrise? Okay, how many have you seen in your life? Like hundreds?
Yeah.
And tonight, when I get to my deck, I'm going to sit down there sipping a coffee. Oh, this is beautiful. Why? The fascination we have for universe. And then, and if you look through the dates, it would be interesting, but there is so many principles that were laid down by Christians as early as the 4th century to explain how we as Christians can work into discovery and science, all these things, all the way to Sir Isaac Newton, who clearly said, for him, the reason why he can understand the world because he was created by God. And the reason why it's worth understanding is because he brings glory to him. So people in theistic environments, monotheistics or polytheistics, were motivated by 2 concepts that wouldn't be there if there was evolution. Number one is you can understand the world around you, so go ahead and investigate. And number 2, you will glorify your God or your gods because they're amazing in how they create. And I think one thing that science does through the century is showing how even more amazing the world is.
Yeah.
We know more things today, and the more complex the world becomes, the more we understand it, and the less the argument of God non-existence become valid. The world is too complicated. There's a great video out there. It's called The Privileged Planet.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss it. But the point being, in the whole argument of the I think it's an hour and 15 minutes video, how impossible it is if all the factors are not in line properly, finely tuned. That's the argument. If all these things were not finely tuned, the distance to the sun, the size of the moon, the size of our sun, the number of planets, the habitability zone, the amount of water, the content of our atmospheres, the angle of the axle of all these things are perfectly done, and we're perfectly placed within the Milky Way galaxy to offer the possibility of life and also the possibility of observing the universe, because we're in one place in the Milky Way galaxy where there's no nebulas. So we can see out there. If we're like a few, 3% one way, 3% we're on the way, number one, we would have a cloudy sky all the time, and we would be bombarded by meteorites all the time. So the point being is, all these things show us that the fine tuning of made life possible, and the odds of that are astronomical. So when I look at all this, I'm realizing science not only does not disprove the existence of God, but actually brings the point even further. How can this impossible life came into being if there is no one intelligent behind it?
Yeah.
So they're not in conflict.
They're not in conflict, and I think that the hope, I guess, maybe for some people, like going in and trying to study the way that things are, is a hope to kind of prove that God does not exist. But as you were just saying, maybe it does the other effect where I learn more about, thinking about doctors or physicians or surgeons or whatever, is like, how do you think that this is an accident when all these things are correlated with one another? And in other scientific fields, I'm sure that's the case as well, where I am trying to prove God doesn't exist and I'm actually convinced that he does. There's the case for Christ is one of those where it's like, I think, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but he was trying to prove that God didn't exist. And in his pursuit of that, and maybe this is where some people are scientifically, where I'm trying to find the answers to these questions outside of God, maybe you need to reincorporate God into that equation, because maybe that's one of the that's the answer for those questions that you have about those things. So, great conversation. Thanks so much, Philippe, for all your insight, these apologetic arguments and different people. It's been a great time, and make sure you check out the rest of the episodes this week about apologetics, and be sure to subscribe in all the different places: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, and have a great day.